Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Christian Democracy, where we talk about Catholic social teaching in the light of contemporary affairs. My name is Jack Quirk, and we begin with a prayer. Father, let us be the hands that bring food to the hungry, drink to the thirsty, clothing to the naked, healing to the sick, comfort to the prisoners, and welcome to the strangers. May everything that is said here be in furtherance of these things, and of your truth and your love, through Christ our Lord. Amen. And tonight, our guest is Julia Smucker, who, if you follow Patheos Catholic blogs, needs no introduction, but I'll go ahead and give you an introduction anyway, because she certainly deserves one. She writes for Vox Nova, which is a blog which now appears on Patheos Catholic, and she is also on the board of the Consistent Life Network. It is a great honor to have her here, and welcome, Julia.
Hello, thank you.
And what I want to start out with is this Consistent Life Network. I've been spending some time taking a look at what they've got going on. They've got a website. It's consistentlifenetwork.org, unsurprisingly, and there you are listed as one of the members of the board. But tell me what it's about. Tell me what Consistent Life Network is about.
Well, it is an umbrella network of individual endorsers and member organizations that are dedicated to promoting the consistent life ethic in some way or another. And there are various member groups that are, some are focused on one or two particular life and death issues, and some dedicated to promoting the consistent life ethic more broadly. It started about 30 years ago as pro-lifers for survival being nuclear survival. So it was the initial concerns were a combination of being pro-life regarding abortion and also anti-nuke. And being concerned with the future of life as we know it.
All humanity.
Yes, all humanity. Yes.
Yes,
so,
but it says right on the front page of the website. It says, we are a network of organizations and individuals committed to the protection of life, which is threatened in today's abortion, poverty, racism, the death penalty, and euthanasia. We believe that these issues are linked under a consistent ethic of life. And you're not only just an organization for this, you manage to be an umbrella of organizations that oppose all these things. That's amazing.
Yes, and so those that are listed on the website that you just mentioned are 6 official what we call core issues, and that can be expanded as well in relation to any forms of violence and any threats to human life and human dignity.
So what do you want? Like heaven on earth or something? What's up with this? I mean, come on. We got to have a little violence, right? Maybe like a rodeo or something at least. No? What about? Okay, so you start out. Let's start out with war. What is the Catholic teaching position, as far as I understand it, is that you could defend yourself, but that's it. I don't know if that I suppose you could get an expert on that to tell me if I'm right. But how is that square with consistent life network?
Well,
Consistent life network, I should say.
Okay, you're going to go through the issues. Well, the Catholic teaching starts with the presumption against taking life.
Right.
So any allowances that might be made to violence would be the exception, and you can see a trajectory of in Catholic social teaching where those exceptions that are allowed for seem to get narrower.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking for myself, I would like to see that narrow to the point where the exceptions disappear altogether. But that is kind of the trajectory, and I have a hard enough time even getting fellow Catholics on board with where the official teaching already is, because what's often invoked is the fact that we have a just war theory, or people even refer to it as a just war doctrine, which kind of tends to imply some creeping infallibility in terms of what is dogmatically defined. But a common argument is because this just war theory exists within the Catholic tradition, therefore Catholics are necessarily required to justify war, and then it even is taken even further as a kind of a carte blanche to justify all war, which is the opposite of what just war theory is meant to do in the first place.
Right. Well, I was going to say with regard to that, I mean, I suppose a watershed moment for me was the second attack on Iraq under Bush II. And suddenly, I mean, there was absolutely no way that could be justified under just war doctrine because, well, Iraq hadn't attacked us. And they were presenting no threat to us. And yet, suddenly, I saw in periodicals, one in particular, that were that I had taken to be fairly orthodox as to Catholic teaching, suddenly trying to justify it in point of fact, even saying maybe it's time to revisit this doctrine. Very, very much the same as the so-called liberal side would say maybe it's time to revisit birth control or abortion or what have you. And that was amazing to me. That was because, I mean, simultaneously, I had been a political agnostic up till that time. And what happened was that I was radicalized by that invasion of Iraq to begin with. I kept going around the office saying, "Well, did you hear we invaded Poland? I mean, Iraq." And it was like, that was kind of my little joke, right? Nobody laughed, but hey, that never stops me. But the point was that this was just an astonishing thing to me that it happened. And then I saw in a Catholic periodical that it was being justified, and I could see no way that it could be justified under Catholic teaching in any of its instantiations. Would the Consistent Life Network agree with me on that?
Well, I should specify as well that the Consistent Life Network is a nonpartisan and non-sectarian organization. So I mean, I think it's pretty safe to say that that from a consistent life ethic point of view, that the view that you've just articulated holds up. That said, the network itself includes a number of member groups from different faith perspectives as well as secular perspectives. So there are a lot of Catholic groups that apply Catholic Catholic teachings and principles, and there are others as well.
All right. So do those ever come into conflict, or in other words, so you were indicating a totally pacifist position. Are there organizations that are totally pacifistic when it comes to war within this network?
Certainly. There, yes, again, and that includes, various religious and non-religious.
But the point is that total pacifism is also included within this network and is articulated as such.
Yes.
So
yes, and I hasten to point out as well, and getting back to Catholic teaching, that is also a position that is included within the Catholic tradition, which is a part of the problem that I have with referring to just war as a doctrine, because the Catholic tradition as a living conversation, it does have room for just war theorists and for total pacifists. It does not have room for a crusader mentality, which would be
there's a history of
would be the opposite of pacifism.
Right. Yeah. Well, now I mean,
it does not have room for justifying violence as a good or celebrating violence as a good.
I think of total pacifism as being, if the foreign hordes invade your territory, that there is no it is unjust to mount any defense against it. Am I misunderstanding? Am I characterizing it, or am I providing a caricature of pacifism, or is that really kind of it?
Well, it is somewhat of a caricature, and it's it includes the assumption that the assumption that at some point your options are violence or nothing, violence or inaction. When in fact, first of all, there's diplomacy and reconciliation as a first resort, and even in situations where that fails, there are nonviolent means of resistance that have been shown to be more effective, simply on a pragmatic level, than violent ones.
Well, I suppose if you are confronted with a country or an army that is overwhelming, that might you might have to pick up a nonviolent type of response, because a violent one would be futile, right? Just like the Borg on Star Trek.
Yes.
Okay, but then I try to bring it into a personal situation. If, say, for example,
oh my goodness,
what?
Well, I can see where you're going, but go ahead.
Oh, okay. So, for example, if I'm at home and suddenly somebody does one of those home invasions, right? I've got a house full of people that might expect me to put some resistance, and might look askance at me if I didn't, and I would agree with them. Does pacifism reach to that level, or is there something else? In other words, I guess another way to put this is, if I am merely responding to violence that is offered, am I actually being violent? Is that violence? Is resistance to violence itself violence?
Well, no, resistance to violence is not necessarily violence. If you're killing someone, then that's violence. And of course, that's a little problem. One of the problems with those sort of hypothetical "what would you do" scenarios is that it assumes, one thing it assumes is that your only options are do nothing or kill this hypothetical person. And the other problem with having a hypothetical person is that they have no moral agency in this scenario. So in this setup, the you of the scenario, the person who's being addressed, is the only one capable of making any choices, of choosing this versus that action, when that is not consistent with reality.
All right. Well, yeah, I know you engage in a hypothetical, and there's always something that can be said about, well, how that's not going to be met up with in concrete circumstances. But of course, a home invasion robbery is not hypothetical. Those things actually happen. Nations are actually invaded. But it's interesting because the next thing that's mentioned is abortion, and abortion obviously is killing the most innocent of all people, right? An unborn child doesn't do anything as a moral agent to harm anyone. But then we run into the situation where, say, there's an ectopic pregnancy or something like that, where the baby has to be removed in order to save the life of the mother. And what how are we not committing a violence against that unborn infant, even though it's to save another life? And how would you think that? I don't know if this has ever been discussed amongst the Consistent Life Network, but how would you think they'd come down on that?
We are consistent in opposing any deliberate acts of violence against a human being.
Right.
So, talking about any medical situation, and specifically medical treatment of pregnancy, it is assumed, if the pregnancy is desired, it's always assumed that there are two patients.
Right.
The mother and the child being carried, and so that is fundamentally the assumption that you have to work with in any kind of medical decision. And I've thought about this, and the nearest analogy that I could come to would be maybe conjoined twins, in terms of a life being so physically dependent on another life or intertwined with another life. But pregnancy is sort of a unique situation in that sense, in the sense of that physical medical dependency. But the principle to always keep in mind, regardless, is that there are two human lives at stake, and they both, the assumption is that in a medical situation that everything possible will be done for the best interest of both of these lives.
Right. In other words, even if the fetus has to be removed, every effort needs to be taken in order to, if possible, preserve the life of the fetus as well. Would you agree with that? Oh,
yes.
All right. So, yeah, I think what this really boils down to, and you tell me where, if you think, I'm I don't know, off on a train to nowhere or what, but I'm thinking that the distinction comes down to what we would aspire to in ethics versus what we would demand in law. Okay? So in other words, turning to the international side, we could look to a nation that responds as would Mahatma Gandhi to an invasion or to an occupation, as he did, and we would uphold that as the pinnacle of human behavior. But at the same time, we wouldn't necessarily put it into international law that all nations must behave that way, because that's perhaps asking too much. Similarly, in the case of an abortion, occasionally I see somebody talking about women risking their lives to carry forward with a pregnancy, and they're held up as an example to be admired. But in that circumstance, perhaps that's not something that we would demand in law. If I mean, there's an old English case where where these guys were left out on the ocean by themselves, and they were stranded. And I guess they ended up eating one of the guys, but the question was whether or not they were guilty of some kind of homicide under those circumstances. And I think if my memory serves, the court decided we don't ask the impossible of people, or at least we don't ask more than what can be expected of somebody of ordinary ethical capabilities. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, well, I would just say, I guess, on the question of law, there is always room for improvement in terms of regulation of forms of violence or laws meant to curb or outlaw or simply make less easy particular forms of violence. And so that's kind of my criterion for judging any potential or actual legislation. Is this, would this make the law more life affirming or more life denying? And having said that, I would also not say that changing laws is necessarily the be all and end all. And there are certainly other ways to promote nonviolence, and to help to make it more possible. But whenever anybody's talking about law or a proposed law, I think you have to judge it from a consistent life perspective by that question. Does this facilitate violence, or does it facilitate life?
Well, I think there's also the progress of society angle. I mean, it might have been at one time that somebody would think it was a really humane law to say don't beat your slaves too hard, but whereas in contemporary society we'd say, what do you mean you're not supposed to have slaves at all? Right? So I mean, and so there's a bit of human progress.
That's kind of what I'm saying about, and I would not be so quick to assume necessarily the inevitability of progress, because sometimes we regress, and so chronology does not necessarily mean that we're getting better. But yes, there is, as I said, always room for improvement. So
right, well,
yes,
well, sure.
I think thankfully.
So it
certainly is a positive that it's pretty much universally recognized now that don't beat your slaves too hard does not go far enough.
Right. And so now Consistent Life Network and its sundry organizations now calls us forward to an ethic that is perhaps a little bit beyond where most people are now. the idea that you can't have any war at all, right? The idea that you would look for alternatives, even in the face of invasion. That's something that's just beyond our grasp. It's beyond the horizon of where we are now. But still, this voice needs to be heard because it pulls us forward towards a place where we might be. Does that make sense? In other words, it's I hate to use the E word, but it's evolutionary in the sense that it gives us a target that we can't reach yet as a society. And that's the function, because obviously, if you look at what the teachings of Jesus are, which is what we're supposed to be all about here as Catholic Christians, or as Christians generally, the nonviolence is clearly the answer to just about everything. Turn the other cheek, resist not evil. Jesus never forced anyone to follow him. In fact, he became the victim of society's violence himself without resistance on his part. And that is the ultimate goal. And yet it is something that is really out of reach for the conception of most people, and for society in general. Yet that message still has to be out there to draw us forward.
Well, I wouldn't want to take that as some kind of an excuse for complacency. Well, that's kind of this impossible ideal that we're sort of vaguely reaching for. Yes, there is always going to be room for improvement to become more consistent, and that is what we're trying to urge and to work toward on all the life issues as a Consistent Life Network and its member organizations. And it's also, in an even more radical sense, like you said, for those of us who are Christians, that is what we're called to follow if we accept the teachings and the lordship of Jesus Christ.
Now, that brings up another subject, which is capital punishment. Now, I don't even have to ask of Consistent Life Network as opposed to capital punishment, because I'm sure you are. And the Catholic Church itself is getting to the point where she is recognizing that in the modern world, there really isn't any circumstances where taking the life, even of those who have committed the most abominable of crimes, can be excused. And since we're at that point, and of course in the United States that might just be the minority position, unfortunately, yet that is something that is attainable. We can do the law of capital punishment. That's something that is completely a matter of law. It's not a matter of, it would be nice if the law was that. Capital punishment can only be affected under the operation of law. And so that's something where legal is a must, wouldn't you say?
Yes, well, that is because it's like war, I suppose. Capital punishment is a form of violence that is state sponsored, and yes, and it's specifically mandated by law. Of course, war used to require, or a declaration of war used to require congressional approval. But even the idea of declaring war has become obsolete. But
now, before the show, you said you didn't want to talk about the Supreme Court.
I didn't mention the Supreme Court. I'm talking about Congress.
Okay, go ahead.
That Congress has to make a formal declaration of war, which has not happened since World War II. But my point is, my point is talking about state-sponsored violence, and in terms of militarism, there have been ways for the state to even get around what the law is. But I think you're right in terms of capital punishment that it is more wholly a question of law, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's morality as applied to law. People are always saying you can't mix morality and law, but I don't see how that's possible. It's interesting. You talk about how the Constitution requires that war can only be started with a declaration of war by Congress, and yet that's actually an area where we can be said to have moved backwards, since now it just seems to be almost an executive prerogative to get ourselves into military engagements. So that's a backward step, as you indicated. The moving forward in time isn't always moving forward in terms of morality.
Exactly.
Yeah. So and it would be nice, wouldn't it, if we had a little bit more deliberation behind our efforts to engage in military, well, certainly military conquest abroad. And really and truly, you could see with the founding fathers were not prophets, and the Constitution was not divinely inspired scripture. But here's one thing that I think that they got right, and I have to say that because a lot of people treat it like that. But here's one where I think they got it right.
Oh, yes.
And that is that the decision to take the nation to war should be a deliberative event and not just something that one guy decides. That's I think evident based on the history that we've had since World War II and the things that we've gotten ourselves involved with. I was 17 when the Paris Peace Accords were signed. I was sweating it. We're talking about Vietnam. My freshman year, the tanks rolled into Saigon, but I missed it. I had to think about what I was going to do about that, and I was actually thinking about being a conscientious objector at that point, because that was terrible. I mean, they were just taking people from field and farm and putting them over there, and for no particular reason that I could see. And it's just amazing that we went through a period like that, and yet we're still doing it. It's mind-blowing, I think, that we didn't learn a lesson there and say, hey, from now on, we're going to engage in a little more deliberation before we embark upon these adventures. So anyway, but turning back to capital punishment, yeah, that's something that has to be done by law. Now, of course, when we talk about what the alternatives to capital punishment are, and this is something that I think that is pertinent to address here, it's always something like life imprisonment behind bars. Now, when it comes to dealing, that's pretty much what we do. I mean, we put them behind bars. We confine them. But confinement is a kind of violence, is it not?
Well, it can be. I mean, certainly there's all kinds of human dignity issues you can go into in terms of prison conditions. Even people who are legitimately imprisoned must be treated humanely as human beings, because nobody can possibly forfeit their fundamental dignity as human beings. But to your other point, yes, I do think that incarceration and life imprisonment is much more normative than it ought to be. I think in certain extreme cases it may be necessary, but yeah, it has kind of become a default in ways that may overlook or fail to even consider the possibility of rehabilitation or reconciliation.
Yeah, I think that it's a much broader question than a lot of people think when we talk about the criminal justice system, clearly. And I'm familiar with an organization. The name escapes me right now, but they are. But the basic idea is to get victim and criminal together and try and work out some kind of contact. I wish I could remember the name.
Right,
you might be familiar with it.
Victim offender reconciliation
program. Yeah.
Restorative justice.
But these are really, I mean, I used to work as an attorney in the criminal justice system, and I used to think, man, when it comes to law, if this was medicine, we would still be using like leeches and bloodletting and stuff like that. That's what stage we're at here, because it's like it used to be that every disease, let's put a leech on, or let's do some bloodletting, and now it's the same thing. Every single crime, well, let's put them in the box. If they do this crime, they go in the box for 30 days. If they do this crime, they go in the box for 5 years. If they do that crime, they go into the box for life. And it's just a matter of confinement. Confinement is the only thing that we know how to do, and yet nobody can say that it has any real impact. I don't think. I mean, we still have a whole lot of crime going on. I mean, sometimes they're just crimes because somebody made it a crime, but you're talking about violence to other people. That's obviously something that society needs to respond to. And we only have one answer to it, and we don't know anything else to do. We're just ignorant, Julia.
Yes, and I think that your analogy to leeches and bloodletting is appropriate, and in the sense that that it not only was that not helpful as a default response to disease, but it often made a problem worse.
Yeah, well, of course, bloodletting may help with blood pressure, right?
Mm.
So it might have been good for one thing.
Right, and yes, and incarceration may be necessary in certain extreme situations where society may be need to be protected from specific individuals who need to not be on the streets, and yet you're like bloodletting, to have mass incarceration as this sort of default automatic solution, it creates a cycle.
Yeah. So
the infamous pipeline.
Or the other thing is a fine. Especially for lesser crimes, you get a fine, and sometimes those fines can be pretty stiff. And that, I suppose, that can actually be a deterrent. But boy, you're really sticking it to somebody if you give them a really heavy fine. And what's the old saying about the law is just because it prohibits both the rich and the poor from stealing bread? Okay, so you can fine a rich man $2,000 and you can fine a poor man $2,000, but the poor man's going to feel that a lot more. And it gives the appearance of fairness, but in reality, it's not fair at all. I mean, it hits the poor much more than it does the rich. And I suppose you can say, well, I'm a dreamer, like the song says, if I want the law to be fair, but you can see that the the way that we do it, even when it comes to something as simple as a fine, is really ham-handed. It's like we don't, after all these years, we don't really think about what we're doing when it comes to criminal punishment.
Yes, and
I
it's
hope I'm
often
making
not
sense.
even justly consistently applied.
Well, even when it is justly and consistently applied, it's different for different people. Like I said, both the rich guy and the poor guy get a $2,000 fine. That's not really equal. It's equal in number. It's equal in arithmetic, but it's not really equal. And so and it's almost as if we address these issues, or if we even raise an issue like this, it's like you want people to just walk around and you want chaos? No, it's just, my point is that we haven't really given enough consideration to criminal justice so that we can lift ourselves out of the bloodletting stage, is my point. But all along, and the reason why this dovetails with the larger issue here today, and that is that when somebody is up for criminal punishment, you are actually affecting a kind of violence on them, because you are about to impose something upon them that they would rather not have. Okay, you actually have to take them to jail. You actually have to hold them in, because if you didn't do that, they would just go about their business. Okay, no, people don't. To the extent that people voluntarily comply with their punishment, they do so because of the greater societal violence that we brought to bear upon them if they don't. And that's,
well, now you're sounding like a libertarian.
well, except I'm wondering if we go too far and we equivocate between violence and evil, if we don't end up being libertarians on some level.
Wait a minute. Okay, wait. We need to redraw the distinctions here, because it's, the problem is not that violence is not an evil, but now you're equating anyone having to do something that they don't want to do with violence.
No, I'm saying somebody being forced to do something that they don't want to do is violence.
Well, it depends on, and it depends on what the force is. I mean, you can use certain physical restraints. Handcuff somebody and put them in prison, or what have you. And I'm not necessarily opposed to using certain non-harmful, certainly non-lethal physical restraints, if necessary, and that's not necessarily equivalent to violence.
All right. So are we really talking about life issues here? Are we talking about the right to life and the dignity associated with that, rather than what I would say call physical coercion? Is that really the issue?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that is the distinction that I'm making, and even with physical coercion, that when that has to be done, it has to be consistent with human dignity. You don't just rough the guy up more than is necessary because you think he's a bad guy.
Or you don't parade him down the street and have people throw tomatoes at him, right?
Right.
Okay. Well, see, now you've spoiled a lot of people's fun there, Julia. That's what they look forward to on a weekend. But this is these are, yeah. I think that, but you can understand why I think it's important to draw bright lines here, so that and I'm absolutely sympathetic with a nonviolence that or that imposes no more coercion than necessary, but is still consistent with a necessary social order. I mean, we obviously bank robbers can't run around free, or people who rob stores. I mean, there has to be some way of keeping them from doing that. But at the same time, I sure wish that we could be a little more scientific about figuring out why people do these things, because sometimes it's pretty hard to explain. You know, I was just talking to my wife a little while ago and about having her come on and talk about fetal alcohol syndrome, and and she's kind of become an expert in that. And there are a lot of things that I think can be, in terms of criminal activity, that can be ascribed to what a person is subjected to when he or she is still in the womb. The brain damage that can result from alcohol or drugs or what have you, and how that impacts their ability to reason and confront situations that may befall them. And I wonder how much a serious look at that would actually eliminate the need for much of this coercion that we're talking about. And so, in other words, my point is that the subject of criminal punishment and the subject of violence that we want to avoid is broad. It encompasses just a lot of areas that doesn't seem to be obvious at first. And I hope that made sense, because if it didn't, I'm just going to have to subject myself to whatever treatments that are necessary. But that just seems to be the case for me. I don't know. What do you think?
Oh, yeah. Well, certainly. Of course, it encompasses a lot of things. And I think the real fundamental, in terms of both the consistent life ethic and Catholic social teaching, and where they really dovetail, is human dignity.
Right.
And that is universal. It is innate. It is inviolable, in the sense that certainly offenses can be committed against human dignity, and are tragically every day, and it's violated in that sense. But it is inviolable in the sense of being indelible.
Well, it's interesting because this kind of goes into the other areas that you mentioned. You mentioned poverty, or the Consistent Life Network mentions poverty and racism as well, and as being of concern to the Consistent Life Network. And these are, poverty and racism are certainly life issues, as we've seen. You don't have enough to eat, you die. People who are subjected to racism are often killed because of that. And these are issues that somebody, maybe at first blush, when you say a Consistent Life Network, they're just in favor of they're just opposed to both abortion and capital punishment and euthanasia. But poverty and racism come into it too as well, don't you? Obviously, you agree, because that's the position of the Consistent Life Network.
Yes, well, that's interesting, because those two were added at some later point to the official core issues, and they do differ from the others listed in that unlike war, abortion, the death penalty, and euthanasia, poverty and racism are not in themselves cases of direct killing. And yet they are issues of human dignity, and sometimes, as you said, they can lead fairly directly to untimely, unnatural death.
Yes, well, certainly. I mean, when children are malnourished, it impacts their entire life, and may result in an earlier death than otherwise would be the case. And racism clearly has that same impact. I mean, if somebody thinks that a person is more dangerous simply because of their race and therefore shoots them when it would otherwise be, when it is unjustified, not when it would otherwise be unjustified, when it is unjustified, those become very directly life issues. And the quality of life, if it's a bad quality of life, can actually shorten life. I don't think there's any question about that. So it was wise, whoever decided to make that a core issue of the Consistent Life Network. It certainly was essential that these two categories be added, because you can't have human society with human dignity. You can't really have a pro-life society, I don't think, without looking to poverty and racism.
Yes, and this is another important point, that it's not just about prolonging life or indirectly causing life to be cut short, but it is about this is something that is foundational to Catholic social teaching as well. That the right to life includes not only the right not to be violently killed, although it certainly presumes that, but even beyond that, it also includes the right to a dignified life, that is a life that is consistent with one's inherent dignity as a human being, or in other words, you can say the right to life also means the right not to be treated inhumanely.
So waterboarding is out.
Yes. Well, the Catholic Church already defines torture as intrinsic evil.
Yeah. Oh gosh, darn! You found that, did you? There's there's a lot of folks that aren't exactly sure about that, but yeah, there it is, right there in the Catechism. Don't torture people. I don't know if that's an exact quote. It isn't, but yeah, I mean, it is an intrinsic evil. No torturing. So that means no waterboarding. Of course, sometimes people will try and play semantic games and say, well, waterboarding isn't really torture. And, somebody always says, okay, do you volunteer to submit yourself? There was one talk show host that was going to do that. I don't know if he ever followed through with it. But yes, torturing is wrong. It's amazing the things you got to say, right? But yeah, yes. You can't do that. That torturing is bad, and it is inconsistent, you're saying, with the right to life, because the right to life is more than just the right to have your working and your heart beating. It is also the right to have a quality of life, one that is worth living. Therefore, one in which you are free from what? And free from being tortured, and free from being judged by the color of your skin or whatever other conditions you might be having in your life. And I think that this moves over into the mistreatment of gay people over the years. It's a subject that I find dicey, because obviously the Catholic Church has its teachings with regard to marriage and so forth. But on the other hand, it's amazing how people have taken biblical teaching on the question of same-sex marriage or so forth, and they have translated that into some type of right to mistreat people, as if that were okay. In other words, as if there was no other kind of sinner in the world. Okay, so if somebody commits adultery, I have a right to drag it behind a truck. I mean, you see what I'm saying? That's why it's so dicey, because people in that community have suffered so much at the hands of the righteous non-gay population that it's really impossible to say anything against the objections that they have raised against society in general. Do you follow me?
Oh, yes. Yes, certainly. And there is never an excuse to treat someone inhumanely. That is a part of their right to life.
No matter what, and that's exactly right. What. And so, there's a priest afoot that's trying to make that point, and I wish I could. It's one of those things where I'm in my 60s, Julia, and my brain doesn't work. I always say my brain doesn't work as well as it used to, but truthfully, it never worked that well. I believe his last name is Martin, and he's trying to make that point, and he's being called a heretic by all kinds of groups.
You mean Jim Martin, the Jesuit?
Yes, him. Of course, he's a Jesuit, right? And he's talking about these things, probably in a much more articulate fashion than I just did, and yet he's accused of heresy, of abandoning the Catholic faith. It's an amazing thing to watch. What is it? In other words, what catechism or what book did somebody read that gave them the impression that Catholic teaching is that we can be cruel to anybody or mistreat anybody or treat anybody as anything less than a human being? I don't get it. Do you have any understanding of that, Julia? Do you have any better insight than me?
Well, I don't know. I think you pretty much said it, and I would just say that the idea of any justification of treating any human being as less than a human being is completely missing the point.
Oh, yeah, I would say it's that's the golden rule, isn't it? Treat others as you would be treated, not treat others as you think they deserve it. Treat others as you would be treated yourself. That's if we don't follow that, we're not getting anywhere, no matter how many rules we follow otherwise, right? I mean, that just seems that,
yeah.
That's where I come down. That's what I hope that that's clean, but apparently it isn't. But there's one last thing that you talk about, and that's euthanasia. So apparently you're opposed to getting rid of Grandpa when he becomes too much of a burden, or what?
Well, yes, but part of the problem is this this internalized or externalized sense of pressure. People feeling like they're a burden.
What's going to happen is that once euthanasia becomes de rigueur, then the pressure's going to be on Grandpa and Grandma to say, well, hey, don't you think you're being a little bit of a burden on your kids now? All the medicine they have to buy for you, and, they have to carry your stuff inside and help you through the door and what have you. I mean, come on, they've got they want a water ski. They don't want to be messing with this, and they're going to say, yeah, okay, that's right. And, how parents are always thinking more about their kids than anybody else, right? And their grandkids. It's be a moral pressure to cave into this, and it's apart from the theology that tells us that our life comes from God and not from ourselves. That's a very practical aspect of that whole problem that is going to be an issue once euthanasia becomes the law of the land, which I think it already is in one state. But we're getting to the last couple of minutes here of our program, and I hope this has been enjoyable for all who are listening now and all who will be listening on the podcast. And well, Julia, your reputation precedes you as being really smart. If you ever go to the blog Vox Nova, it's not her blog all by herself, but she's written for Vox Nova, and she's also written for Christian Democracy back when Christian Democracy was not a Patheos blog. And it it was amazing just the things you would come up with. I mean, you want to read some concise and logical writing about some very important issues. I urge you to go to Vox Nova and look at the whole Vox Nova blog there on Pathos Catholic. But when you see the name Julia Smucker there, pay particular attention, because it's really going to be you'll be well rewarded. I promise you. So, Julia, I really want to thank you for agreeing to come on this program and talk with me. I know that you've you wanted to be precise in everything you said, and you pulled that off. So I'm going to thank you, Julia. Good night, and I'm going to say
thank you. As you like to say, flattery will get you everywhere.
Good night from everyone at Christian Democracy.
Good night.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.